during tonight's conversation, if you can just provide some feedback, I'll have Aaron provide a little bit more information too in terms of how to best use these notebooks, but we will be passing out notebooks and pens. So after I walk away from here, just raise your hand if you don't have that notebook yet, and we'll make sure you get it. Perfect. Thank you, Jack. So my name is Isabel Erb. I'm on the activities committee, and so I'm just going to get us started here tonight and introduce our main speaker here, and then I'll allow Aaron to kind of give you guys a sense of what the plan is for tonight. Aaron Tracy is a writer and producer from Washington, D.C., whose TV credits include Law & Order SVU and Sequestered, a legal thriller he created that ran 2 seasons. Tracy co-created The Tap, a dark historical drama about secret societies, which he made alongside one of his heroes, Rob Reiner. Tracy has also developed and sold original series to CBS, USA, Freeform, Lifetime, Lionsgate TV, and others. The first audio series Tracy created, The Coldest Case, a thriller starring Aaron Paul, became Audible's most successful original, ranking in the global top 10. Tracy's on faculty at Yale, where he teaches creative writing. So please join me in warmly welcoming Aaron Tracy tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I swear I asked for that just to be one sentence, but you got a lot. Thank you guys so much for coming to this. Really, really appreciate it. It's a work in progress, so I'm very excited to get your feedback, your honest feedback. If you haven't grabbed a notebook, they're going around now, and a pen. And then afterwards, we'll talk. So a little bit of background on the project. This is something I've been working on for a while. It's 10 half-hour episodes about the very unusual, very noisy life of Roald Dahl. It's being produced by Imagine Entertainment, and it's been commissioned by iHeartMedia. So in October, all episodes will be on iHeart, but they'll also be available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and everywhere else. There is no video element to this. It is entirely audio. And tonight, I am presenting episode 1 of 10. So in terms of what to think about for feedback, I mean, quite literally, I would be excited if you have a line pitch, if you just tell me none of it is good and I should start over. Does the opening grab you? Is Dahl a compelling enough lead? Really, truly, the structure, anything you can think of. You won't be able to hear the music tonight. We're going to have a great score. Really talented composer and editor is on board who made the music for the first season of Serial, which maybe you can hear in your head. He's going to do something great for us, too. One last important thing as we dive in. For this event only, we are incredibly lucky to have Delilah Napier and Charlie Foster here with us. 2 really great young actors, Yale alums, both of whom were in my class. And just making their way in the world, really doing incredible things. So tonight, Charlie and Delilah, there are lots of clips in my show, right? I'll cut away to Roald Dahl, a snippet of Roald Dahl doing an interview, or a snippet of a movie that I'm referencing. Instead of playing those clips tonight, Charlie and Delilah are gonna perform those clips. So if that doesn't make any sense, it's because it's a really weird idea, but hopefully it's gonna work. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so at the very top of the show, we're going to create a short, fast montage of phone calls with my friends and family, some of whom are here tonight. Basically, I'm going to call people up. We're going to record it all. I'm going to ask them what they know or think they know about Roald Dahl. We're then going to sort of splice it all together and turn it into a montage. I have scripted how it might play out, but the charm will hopefully come from sort of the loose, unscripted, cozy feeling of a fun, friendly space for the listener. Just sort of making it clear right from the top that this is not a boring academic biography. So again, this is how it might play. Heidi, what do you know about Roald Dahl?
I know he wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and was maybe an anti-Semite.
Okay. Dad, who is Roald Dahl?
Children's author, James, and the Giant Peach. Controversial. His books were censored a couple years ago, I think.
Hannah, what do you think of when I mention Dahl?
Well, you've been working on this project for what feels like a million years, so I think I'm a world expert on him from osmosis. Thank you very much.
Fine, congratulations. But what do you picture when you imagine Dahl?
I guess like an old, bald man kind of hunched over in a long sweater vest.
Okay. Alyssa, did you know that Dahl was a fighter pilot? Flew a bunch of really dangerous missions in World War II, got shot down multiple times. He was basically Tom Cruise in Top Gun.
Really? I always thought of him as Willy Wonka, like a weirdo recluse.
He was kind of the opposite of that. He was also a slick Hollywood screenwriter for many years. He didn't start writing kids' books till his mid-40s. Before that, he wrote movies for Walt Disney, Alfred Hitchcock, Robert Altman. He wrote one of the Sean Connery James Bond movies. And he got that gig because he basically was James Bond in real life.
Wait, what do you mean?
I mean, during the war, Roald Dahl was a spy for British intelligence.
What?
His job was literally to seduce the wives of powerful Americans in order to sway them into helping Britain in the war. And he was really good at it.
I don't think that's true.
I'm telling you, the guy was a spy. Hear it from the man himself.
My job was to try to help Winston Churchill get on with FDR and tell Winston what was in the old boy's mind in America.
One last thing as we now jump into the body. I've written a ton of audio shows, but this is the first one that I'm actually hosting myself. So I would be very happy if your comments also include what's wrong with my voice, or pacing, or tone, or anything you can think of is also great. Everyone knows the name Roald Dahl, but in my experience, very few know about the giant, really vibrant secret life he led. That's what we're going to explore in this show. I'm your creator and host, Aaron Tracy, and I should admit right off, I have always been totally obsessed with Dahl. He's such an enigma, the most commercially successful children's author of all time, uniquely in touch with the greatest hopes and greatest fears of little kids, and also this dashing super spy who, according to his friend Antoinette Marsh,
Slept with everybody on the East and West Coast that had more than $50,000 a year.
which is kind of hard to accept if the image you have of Dahl in your mind is the one I have. The old, disheveled BFG lookalike, wearing the worn-out cardigan and shaped like a spoon. I'm a writer, and I teach in the English department at Yale, so books have always been a huge part of my life. And Dahl's were the first ones I ever read on my own. Dahl's stories are what turned me on to reading, and the movies made from his books have always been touchstones for me. I'm not alone. The man has sold over 300 million books and counting. He's been translated into 63 languages. How many languages can you even name? There's no way I can name 63. Spanish, French, Chinese, I'm almost out. And let me put that 300 million copies sold into context. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize-winning author who popularized magical realism and whose work actually shares a bit in common with Dahl's, has sold around 1/10 of Dahl's total. Colleen Hoover, who dominates the bestseller list, recently holding 6 of the top 10 spots, also less than 10%. Fellow children's author Shel Silverstein, about 9% of Dahl's total. Herman Melville, Henry James, Virginia Woolf, Toni Morrison, Philip Roth add up all of their sales of all of their books, and it equals about 8% of Dahl's. That is a nutty number. Here's another one. The Hollywood Reporter says Netflix spent around $1 billion for the rights to adapt Dahl's work for film and TV. $1 billion. Here we are, decades after Dahl's death, and he's still everywhere. Recent adaptations of his work have starred George Clooney, Anne Hathaway, Johnny Depp, and Meryl Streep. Steven Spielberg and Wes Anderson have directed film versions. Timothy Chalamet played a young Willy Wonka on his own film. And stage versions of The Witches and Matilda played to sold-out audiences every night. Which isn't to say I don't have my issues with the man. He could be a difficult guy, sometimes incredibly nasty to those he's closest to, kind of like some of his characters. Dahl's personality defects and his controversies have sucked up a lot of oxygen in discussions around him the past few years. We'll definitely get into all that. It's fascinating, sometimes ugly stuff. But for now, I'll just say it's a strange, super complicated thing to admire so much about Dahl, with the knowledge that he would not have come to my Hanukkah party. My friend, the writer Ben Dolnick, captures the dilemma well in a short essay on Dahl, reflecting on his daughter's burgeoning love of reading, that extraordinary, silent, inexpensive, schedule-disrupting passion. Ben wrestles with watching her cherish a book written by a man who may have been repelled by her very existence. I want to start the show off by talking to friends about their images of Dahl, because the weirdness that people perceive in him is really telling. Here's the opening of a BBC profile on Dahl from 1982.
The man who lives in this house makes very good orange marmalade. He also breeds orchids. He has never eaten a dish of tripe in his life. And he wishes that his dog could speak to him. And that eccentric sequence of autobiographical irrelevance may even give you a clue as to who he is. He's Roald Dahl, of Norwegian and Welsh origins, and by now probably the most widely read author of children's books in the entire world. Titles like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, Danny, the Champion of the World, and most recently the BFG, the Big Friendly Giant. They're the sort of books that have brought him such a worldwide readership that he's reputed to spend £200 a month on postage alone, answering the questions from his young readers.
Who else in the world ever would be introduced like that? The man who lives in this house makes very good orange marmalade? But that's how people talk about Dahl, as if he's this peculiar, almost mythological character. Honestly, I think it's at least partly due to his appearance. A real-life giant at 6'6", whose head stuck out of the propeller planes he flew in the war. Plus, he's got that name that's so unusual for most people. And his creativity is just so off the charts. So with all that, he can't possibly be like you and me, right? People are desperate for him to be a real-life BFG, or Miss Trunchbull, or Willy Wonka, or any of his standout characters. Which, fine, is maybe not that unfair or unusual. We definitely imagine that Hemingway was as haunted as his characters. We'd be furious if Phoebe Waller-Bridge wasn't as raw or hilarious as hers. The difference, of course, with Dahl is that his creations are so much further removed from reality. So, was Dahl really as mischievous and outlandish, whimsical and grotesque as his characters? Sort of. People tie themselves up in knots trying to figure out what kind of response they should have to him. When he died, my hometown newspaper, the Washington Post, wrote,
"No children's author of the past 30 years has regularly sparked more controversy than Roald Dahl. On the one hand, kids consistently made him their favorite writer. On the other, our best critics maintain that his books are larded with gratuitous violence, bigotry, sexism, vulgarity, greed, and all manner of foulness."
And that's his obituary. It's like they decided to roast him one last time just to make sure he was really dead. All of these different personas live inside this one giant man. The fighter pilot, the international spy, the Pied Piper of young readers, the kindly old man writer, the rescuer of Jews, the anti-Semitic curmudgeon. It's nuts. You would not expect Jason Bourne to be able to sit down and type out 49 books and short stories. And you wouldn't expect Stephen King to shoot down Nazis or seduce powerful women to manipulate their geopolitics. But Dahl does all of that. So now let me tell you about Dahl's very strange life as a very real secret agent. We could do a whole series just about the truly bananas espionage outfit that Dahl gets recruited into. It's a group of British spies stationed in America with a name that sounds like it should be a World War II buddy comedy starring Will Ferrell and Vince Vaughn, the Irregulars. The Irregulars are a network of agents operating outside traditional military and governmental frameworks. But before I tell you about them, a tiny bit of background. The early 1940s are one of those rare times that it's not at all an exaggeration to say the fate of the entire world is at stake. Hitler is on the march, and it's not assured that he and the Axis powers will be defeated, mostly because the US is sitting on the sidelines. The British ambassador warns his government that 9 out of 10 Americans are determined not to help Britain and to stay the hell out of the war. Most famously, Charles Lindbergh.
It is now obvious that England is losing the war. I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send. That is why the America First Committee has been formed.
And this is while Germany is sweeping through Europe. The Nazis take Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. And America, we're just watching it unfold. The US is wary of getting involved in yet another world war an ocean away. Many, if not most Americans, still remember the horrors of the First World War. The thinking is simply that Hitler is not our problem. The public isn't yet aware of what's going on with the Jews of Europe. The reports of them being rounded up and sent to concentration camps is just too impossible to believe, so we choose not to. Britain, of course, is on the brink. You know this. You've seen the movies, read the books, listened to the podcasts. It's Britain's darkest hour. It's quite clear to Winston Churchill that if FDR doesn't send help, and fast, England is done. So if you're Churchill and your nation's very existence is at stake, what wouldn't you do to persuade America to come to your rescue? At that point, is anything off the table? This is where spycraft comes in. Roald Dahl is in his early 20s. He's coming off a few years in the Royal Air Force. He's fiddling with short stories in his spare time, hasn't yet decided to make a career of it. But he's looking for what to do with his life. He's desperate to get away from his family home, which is colored by immense tragedy. His father and sister both died very young, within a month of each other. The house is cloaked in darkness for Dahl. Living through that tragedy has given Dahl a kind of grand intention with his life, which is maybe even subconscious, but in every action he takes, you can see a kind of striving for immortality that his father and sister could not achieve. Out in the rural English countryside, Dahl is also far removed from the kind of electric city life he's hungry for. Dahl is an incredibly handsome, charming, brilliant young man who fully notices the effect he has on people. He senses there's something special about him. He's desperate to go out into the world and see what he can do. In May of 1942, Dahl is at a cocktail party that a date has dragged him to. He's bored. It's a boring crowd. So he's a little shocked when he spots someone he recognizes from the newspapers. It's a member of Churchill's war cabinet, Major Harold Balfour, standing alone in a corner, just like Dahl is. Dahl takes a deep breath, and with all the arrogance he carries with him his whole life, Dahl walks right up to the major and just starts chatting. Dahl gives great chat. His conversation skills have all the hallmarks of his later fiction. Funny, creative, a little dirty, totally compelling. Dahl is one of those people who just instinctively knows how to captivate. I'm always jealous of those people, the ones who have small crowds gathered around them at parties, telling a story at just the right pace, with just the right amount of detail, and have everyone hanging on every word. Dahl senses this could be his chance. At what? He has no idea. But impressing the major might just lead to something. The major, like everyone else who meets Dahl in this period, is taken with him. He tells Dahl that he's looking for bright, well-educated young men to go to America to join the British Embassy. Dahl was right. This could lead to something. This has led to something, though he's dead wrong about what it is. Cue the thriller music. What the major leaves out is what he really has in mind for Dahl: military intelligence. The head of the irregulars has tasked the major with finding brilliant, articulate, morally flexible young men with military backgrounds to join his outfit. The major seems to have found such a man. The very next week, Dahl is on a plane to Washington. When Dahl first arrives in DC, he is entranced. It's this big cauldron of power, ego mixed with ambition, mixed with sex, mixed again with power, but also has the small town feel of a college campus. I grew up in DC, and in the northwest part of it, everywhere you go, every restaurant, every bookstore, every coffee shop, people are talking politics. It's in the water supply, just like the entertainment industry in LA. So every room Dahl walks into is an opportunity to meet the right person, to overhear or get involved in the right conversation with high stakes outcomes, or that could lead to personal advancement. Dahl's trickiest endeavor when he first arrives is finding decent housing in the notoriously cramped city. He finally finds a nice enough place he can afford. The reason he can afford it is because there was a bloody murder-suicide inside the apartment last week. The murder victim, Rosemary Sigley, was a beautiful young researcher for the agency that became the CIA. She was also a wealthy heiress. Rosemary was killed by her boyfriend, who was also her boss. It was a giant scandal. And 2 days after she was shot and killed, there was a line of people outside waiting to see if the scene of the crime would be rented at a discount. You gotta love the real estate market. Dahl does. He's the first man in line. That's who he is. He's not bothered by something so gruesome and nasty. He's maybe even a little drawn to it.
One of you tried to kill me and poison me. Who? Matilda.
So much of Dahl's fiction pulls the reader towards scenes of total dread. He's able to conjure these scenes so well because they're part of the fabric of who he is. He sees darkness everywhere, so he barely even notices it anymore. When Dahl moves into Rosemary's apartment, it takes him 2 nights before he spots the bloodstains still on the carpet and the single bullet hole in the ceiling. Dahl is ostensibly in DC to work for the British Embassy. But as soon as he starts, he grows restless. It's a lot of sitting at a desk. Dahl wants something bigger. He's searching for something with meaning, something that will give him that feeling of transcendence. Luckily, he soon finds that others want that for him too. Now, the big legendary figure you need to know about right now is William Stevenson, codename Intrepid. Stevenson is Winston Churchill's head of espionage in America. He's one of the key inspirations for the character of James Bond, which was created by Ian Fleming, one of Stevenson's agents. This gives you a sense of what Stevenson looks like. Handsome, sharp features, very clean cut. In order to accomplish Britain's goals in America during this really scary time, Stevenson has put together an elite spy outfit. This is that Vince Vaughn, Will Ferrell buddy comedy I mentioned, The Irregulars. They're a collection of charming, attractive young spies who serve under the British Security Coordination, or BSC for short, which, according to Dahl biographer Janet Conant, is one of the most controversial and probably one of the most successful covert action campaigns in the annals of espionage. Stevenson has a very good eye for talent. The list of BSC alumni is pretty wild. There's Dahl, of course, and Ian Fleming, who creates James Bond, and David Ogilvy, who invents modern advertising. So picture Roald Dahl, James Bond, and Don Draper all hanging out, drinking and seducing their way through a foreign capital during wartime, and you start to have a sense of what it was like. The whole thing feels like the premise of a prestige thriller series. Beautiful, rakish young men recruited into a secret organization far from home because of their smarts, persuasiveness, and talent for deception, tasked with nothing less than saving the free world from fascism. The mission of the Irregulars is broad: gathering intelligence, sabotaging enemies, creating propaganda. According to the BSC's official history, Stevenson and his men are empowered with the vague and therefore wide-ranging task of doing all that was not being done and could not be done by other means. They call themselves the Irregulars, by the way, after the Baker Street Irregulars, the group of street-smart kids who assist Sherlock Holmes in his cases. These guys have a flair for the dramatic. Dahl can't believe his good luck being recruited into this group. A month ago, he was in the English countryside, desperate to get out, desperate to find an adventure and something that would utilize his skills. Now he's found a role filled with subterfuge, deceit, and role play, with the highest stakes imaginable. It's as if he's willed this job into existence. But he better succeed, because after a taste of this, he knows he can't go back home to Buckinghamshire and tend to the sheep. You can tell how formative it all is for Dahl by the fact that bits and pieces from his time in the Irregulars pops up later in his fiction. Willy Wonka seems partially inspired by Stevenson and others Dahl works for in the Irregulars. These enigmatic, controlling men with hidden motives bear more than a little resemblance to the chocolate recluse. And the secret society and the witches who perform covert missions, or the secret plot of poaching pheasants and Danny, the champion of the world, all ripped from his time here. Stevenson's Irregulars are so far failing at their task of wrangling America into the war. They're forced to get creative. One of my favorite of their tactics is hiring a Hungarian astrologer, Louis de Waal, to publicly predict Hitler's demise and therefore make Germany seem less scary to Americans. It's like a PR smear campaign on the fascist dictator. The astrologer is sent on a national tour of America to persuade us it's our destiny to defeat Hitler. Astrologers aside, Stevenson's prime tactics involve targeting the upper echelons of the US government, the ones that can actually compel us to enter the war. If Britain can get someone close to the American president, that would be invaluable. Someone who can persuade FDR, or at least report back on where his mind is. Enter young Roald Dahl. It turns out to be one of Dahl's skills in particular that makes him especially effective with the Irregulars. It's the same skill he'll later become legendary for, his storytelling. Dahl is dabbling in short stories at this time. Like many young writers, he's finding his voice by writing mostly autobiographically. Specifically, he's churning out brief fiction pieces inspired by his childhood and his time in the RAF. The stories are imaginative and dark, a little bit scary, and totally original. One story in particular centers on these grotesque little creatures he calls gremlins, which has nothing to do with the 1984 Steven Spielberg classic.
All that from water that got wet? Yep, plain water.
Dahl's is a fun little Gothic story, which doubles as a fable for American and British cooperation. It's kind of a perfect Dahlian story, actually. I think one of the reasons Dahl's work continues to be read, seen, and performed over a century after his birth is that it draws on all of our collective fears and desires. Like Greek mythology, his stories speak to our most primal, universal issues. Not to mention, they're incredibly funny and creative, unusual and emotional. The Gremlins has all of this. Dahl manages to get the story published in a local DC magazine. Readers are completely taken with it. And as sometimes happens, readers who love the story pass it around to their pals. Of course, in these days, that means literally handing your copy of the physical magazine to your buddy. Hard to imagine something going viral with that method today, but that's pretty much what happens. And of course, it's helpful that the magazine has a big local circulation. It's left on DC streetcars, in movie theater restrooms, and placed on coffee tables in Washingtonians' living rooms. Eventually, because this is just how Dahl's luck works, his story gets passed to Eleanor Roosevelt, who is delighted by it. In fact, she loves it so much that she asks to meet the talented young author. Here's Dahl, many years later, speaking about his stroke of fortune.
My first little book I wrote was called The Gremlins, which was bought by the Walt Disney. And Eleanor Roosevelt read it to her grandchildren and loved this book, and so I got invited to the White House, and we got to know each other for a bit. And I would go for weekends. FDR had a country palace called Hyde Park, and I used to go there. I was only a young chap of 24 in an RAF uniform, and I had no business being around there.
Someone in Dahl's role could work for decades and never get an opportunity even close to this. For a spy, just befriending a hapless fourth cousin of the Roosevelts, or maybe a lowly staffer or intern in the administration, would be giant. Dahl, in his mid-20s, becomes pals with the first family. And how did he do it? By making up a clever story, a skill he's starting to realize may pay dividends if he keeps at it. Dahl spends his time at Hyde Park swimming, birdwatching, barbecuing, and drinking with the president, first lady, and other guests. He's making mental notes on everything, desperate to report it all back to Stevenson and prove himself in the job. He manages to spend time alone with FDR, mixing martinis before lunch, while the tipsy president says things like, "I just received an interesting cable from Mr. Churchill," and then tells Dahl what Churchill wrote. Surprise, surprise, FDR clearly takes a liking to Dahl, like everybody else. He even drives Dahl around the property in his specially made car. It all feels pretty surreal for a man not that many years out of high school who's been tapped as a spy without given training and is now casually hanging out with the most powerful couple on the planet. At the end of his first weekend with the first family, Dahl furnishes his superiors in England with an incredibly thorough 12-page report. Visit to Hyde Park, July 2nd to 4th. Yeah, he got invited for July 4th. Dahl's report includes everything Roosevelt said about Churchill, his impressions about whether FDR will run for another term, and anything else he thinks could even possibly be relevant. We don't know whether Dahl's report was ever read by Churchill himself, but it seems clear that Dahl's work helps the British government gain insight into where America stands. There's even a suggestion that Roosevelt may have used Dahl to convey information to the British that was impossible for him to state outright for diplomatic reasons. After all, there's little doubt that FDR knew whatever he said in front of young Dahl would find its way back to the Brits. Many years later, speaking about his role in espionage, Dahl says,
"My job was to try to help Winston Churchill to get on with FDR and tell Winston what was in the old boy's mind in America."
That's about the most straightforward Dahl ever is on his role. For the rest of his life, he's very hesitant to discuss the exact nature of his work in Washington. Needless to say, Dahl's handlers are shocked and thrilled with him. And Dahl's early success in his new role only makes him more confident, more arrogant. One of his biographers, Matthew Dennison, writes,
Roald's life had become a double life. He was still ostensibly working for the British Embassy. At the same time, he was a gatherer and conduit of information in Britain's best interests.
One of Dahl's more salacious tasks, as part of the Irregulars, is to seduce powerful women in order to enlist their help in bringing America into the war. This is a task that young Dahl is very excited about. He's also built for it. Years later, his wife Felicity says she thinks Dahl was the most attractive man in Washington at this time. He's someone who looks you right in the eye and makes you feel special because you're talking to someone who only spends time with special people. One of Dahl's important seductions, which comes up in most of what is written about him during this period, is with a powerful, wealthy woman with a very whimsical, very Dahlian name, Claire Booth Luce. Claire lives a giant life, almost as noisy as Dahl's. The Miami Herald compares her life to a cross between Sex and the City and Game of Thrones. In her youth, they write, she is a go-getting, sexually freewheeling, Carrie Bradshaw quipster who revels in the hustle and bustle of Manhattan. By World War II, she's degenerated into a modern-day Cersei Lannister, entitled, power-hungry, and morally hypocritical. Now, the reason Dahl is first sent to Claire is because of who she's married to. Claire is one half of one of the most influential power couples of the century. Her husband is Henry Luce, the co-founder of Time magazine and publisher of Fortune magazine, Life magazine, and Sports Illustrated. He's editor-in-chief of them all until his death. And for the audience tonight, proud alumni, class of 1920. This is a time when magazines are the only place to find long-form journalism. Henry's media empire significantly shapes public discourse, and Britain certainly wants their interests promoted in Time, Life, and other loose publications that are widely read by American policymakers. Henry's magazines sometimes publish articles that could be interpreted as anti-British and sympathetic to American isolationists. Luce believes the Brits are hypocritical in promoting democracy abroad while maintaining colonial rule, and he calls them out for this, which is super upsetting for the British. They are desperate for America's help in the war. It's literally an extinction crisis, so they have to find a way to put a stop to anti-British writings in his magazines. They're not sure how to get to Henry, but maybe they can get to his wife. After all, it's an open secret that their marriage is untraditional. For the final 28 years of their marriage, Henry refuses to have sex with Claire. His reason is that he's in such awe of her that he can't get aroused. He doesn't seem to have the same problem with other women in his circle. But Claire isn't just Henry Luce's wife. She's also a really formidable figure in her own right. Like Dahl, Claire finds incredible success in a number of completely different fields. Again, mirroring Dahl, she starts out as a short story writer. Her first published volume is released in 1931. The New York Times finds it superficial, but praises its lovely festoons of epigrams and writes, "What malice there may be in these pages has a felinity that is purest Angkoran." I have absolutely no idea what that means either. But I guess it's not good, because it pushes Claire to pivot away from short stories and try her hand at playwriting. Turns out she's pretty good at it. In 1936, she writes a play that makes it to Broadway and runs over 600 performances. It's called The Women, and it's a commentary on the pampered lives of wealthy Manhattan socialites, which Claire is about to become. If the play sounds familiar to you, it may be because it's later adapted twice for the movies, with stars like Rosalind Russell and Joan Crawford the first time, Meg Ryan, Annette Bening, and Bette Midler the second time.
Well, girls, looks like it's back to the perfume counter for me. And by the way, there's a name for you ladies, but it isn't used in high society. Outside of a kennel.
Like Dahl, Claire bores easily. After her success with The Women, Claire decides to move into journalism. She starts out paying her dues as a caption writer at Vogue, but soon works her way up to managing editor of Vanity Fair. When World War II breaks out, she decides to try war correspondent for Life magazine. Growing restless yet again, Claire takes her varied experiences in writing, journalism, and in the war, and runs for Congress. Famous, accomplished, beautiful, charismatic, and wealthy, Claire wins her election and is seated on the powerful House Military Affairs Committee, where she is extremely outspoken while being one of the few women in Congress. Here she is years later on the cartoonishly conservative William F. Buckley's talk show, speaking about the subject of men versus women.
Men's brute strength was stronger than women's strength, after which, in order to get out from under, she developed a thing called guile. Guile was a weapon against tyranny.
Later, President Roosevelt will take a dislike to Claire and publicly campaign against her, calling her a sharp-tongued glamour girl of 40, which was apparently an insult. Claire retaliates by accusing FDR of being
the only American president who ever lied us into a war because he did not have the political courage to lead us into it.
Pretty good line. Don't pick a fight with a Broadway playwright. With Claire's seat in Congress and her powerful committee assignment and her unique ability to captivate audiences with her writing, plus her husband's publishing empire, you could argue that Claire might be just about the most influential person of her day, which makes her the perfect target for the irregulars. Q, Vaughn, and Farrell somersaulting into frame, guns drawn, in an alternate fictional universe. Dahl first meets Claire at the New York premiere of a propaganda film, Eagle Squadron. The film is co-written by C.S. Forster, a famous British author who will later play a pivotal role for Dahl. Eagle Squadron is about U.S. airmen who volunteer to fight for the Royal Air Force. Dahl's date to the premiere is Nancy Carroll, a divorced actress 12 years older than Dahl. Beautiful and successful, Carroll is nominated for the Best Actress Oscar a decade earlier, which tells you something about how in demand Dahl is on the social scene. At the after-party, Dahl leans on the bar in his crisp tuxedo as Nancy chats with friends and fawning fans, and Dahl's eye begins to wander. He spots Claire, stunning and brilliant. She's holding court, owning the room. A sly smile across each of their faces as they make eye contact with each other. Dahl does not return home that night. In a weirdly explicit letter to his mother back in Norway, Dahl writes,
I got home to the house of my host at 9 a.m. the next morning and failed to make my room without being seen to ruffle the bedclothes. I had to do a lot of talking to reestablish my reputation.
Yikes, who brags to their mom about getting lucky? With Claire's wealth, she's in a very different social stratosphere than 20-something Dahl, who's living off cheese sandwiches in a tiny walk-up apartment. Even though Claire is already incredibly successful and married, and at 39, 13 years older than Dahl, she falls for him. Here's a tall, handsome ex-pilot who can talk literature and theater with her in a way most DC boys cannot. The relationship is electric, and Dahl is soon complaining to his superiors in the BSC about Claire's appetite. According to Creekmore Fath, a lawyer who serves in FDR's administration, Dahl told him,
I'm all fucked out. That goddamn woman who so absolutely screwed me from one end of the room to the other for 3 goddamn nights. I went back to the ambassador's suite this morning, and I said, you know, it's a great assignment, but I just can't go on. And the ambassador said, Roll, did you ever see the Charles Lofton movie, Henry VIII? And I said, yes. Well, he said, do you remember the scene of Henry going to the bedroom with Anne of Cleves, and he turns and says, the things I've done for England? Well, that's what you've got to do.
Later, Dahl will put the things I've done for England line into Sean Connery's mouth as James Bond. Now, I don't really believe the British ambassador would have spoken this way to one of his young spies. To me, this feels less like a real complaint and more like the kind of icky boasting of a 20-something dude. As we'll talk about next episode, Dahl is prone to more than a little exaggeration in the tales of his exploits. The overall effect Dahl may have had on Claire is pretty profound. It's possible, even likely, that his influence on her fostered a more supportive attitude toward Britain and softened her critical stance, which, in turn, may have helped soften them in her husband's magazines. But, even more importantly, Dahl was in, weekending with the president, carrying on an affair with a congresswoman, and mingling with some of the most powerful figures in the country. In the world of espionage, access is everything, and Dahl has it. For now, Dahl has achieved his goal. He's an ocean away from the darkness of Buckinghamshire, and he's found a career with high stakes, excitement, and adventure. But of course, when anyone is as successful as Dahl is in DC, there are going to be those who don't appreciate it. A charming, arrogant, handsome, 26-year-old foreigner actively practicing espionage on behalf of MI6 in the US and conducting affairs with some of the most powerful women in the nation? Yeah, that's going to engender some serious enemies. The FBI, for one. End of episode 1. So thank you. So I would love to hear any thoughts you have. Nothing too small, nothing too large. You know, not to treat this like one of my classes or something, but if someone says something and you agree with it or disagree with it, I would be thrilled if you would also jump in. I'm curious how everybody feels about it. Do we need to use the microphone, or can people?
Yes, just because we're recording here. So if anyone would like to share any thoughts, I'm happy to. Okay, right over here, and I'll come give you the mic.
I loved it, and I have a very short attention span, so it says a lot. I love your voice. Don't question that. Your voice is made for this. I can see the biopic. I can see the Ryan Murphy, feud version of this. I have no questions. I just wanted to say I especially love when you interject with anything that's personal. It's a nice breather from the history of it, before it starts to feel like a book report, which it doesn't, but just before you're about to maybe wonder if you're still interested. I love the Hanukkah party. I mean, I'm biased, so I love that line, but even when you said the newspapers of your childhood in DC were all politics, keep those going, right?
Yeah, my feeling is, I mean, so much of this can be done with AI now. It's very easy to create a podcast with fake AI voices just telling you the story of Roald Dahl. So I'm kind of allergic it's hard for me to put myself in it, to put my own biography in it, but it does feel like in this new world, it is more important to start doing that, to have these kinds of shows have a personality rather than just be a straight up history.
Yeah, keep making it personal, even when you're talking about, I love when you say Hannah, my wife. I mean, like very minor things, I think, make it feel very like emotionally rich.
You liked
and
that
fun.
you were in the beginning.
And I loved that Alyssa character, yeah.
Anyone else? All right, come on over. Excuse me, sorry.
Very interested. I'm also a pilot, so I was curious about his aviation career. Were there any other personal rivalries that he had? Did he have any rivalries going on with Ian Fleming? And how would he have felt later on how would Fleming have felt later on to see Roald Dahl write his script for You Only Live Twice?
Yeah, good question. And I would be very curious to hear if I got the pilot stuff right.
You were right on.
Yeah, in terms of the personalities, I mean, I wonder how much it affects you. Ian Fleming died 2 years before Dahl got the job to make the James Bond. So it's unclear how Ian Fleming would have felt about it. They were buddies in DC. This whole group, which I'm going to get into in future episodes of Ogilvy, Fleming, Dahl, Noel Coward, they're all doing espionage for the Brits in DC at this time. Dahl was like Fleming's little brother. He was always too scared to sort of hang out with Fleming too much. He really looked up to him. He didn't think he was cool enough to hang with Fleming. And then when Fleming died, and Dahl got the job to write the James Bond, he decided to completely rewrite Fleming. There's almost nothing left from Fleming's book that Dahl's James Bond is
Just names.
based on. Yeah, it's crazy.
So good, Aaron.
Thank you.
My comment is about there's just so much narrative gold, and particularly certain scenes that are just so captivating, like the cocktail party scene and the scene when they have an affair and he doesn't come home. I feel like there's opportunity to, I hate to use this like cliche, but there's opportunity to show don't tell more. There's definitely a need for expository, saying like he was an incredible man and but there's clearly so much there that means you don't have to
Turn it into
tell us
scenes more.
because it's incredible. And I would start just bring us to the moment when the irregulars are created, in the beginning, because that's
I got that
those
note from
three
my editor, too.
people.
Yeah.
I want to know right away because I feel like you buried that a little bit.
Do people agree with that? Sort of bring the irregulars way up?
And bring Claire and their relationship way louder.
What do you mean?
You've got these two electric, extraordinary people, and now they're going to come together.
Yeah.
I mean, I basically just want that. I just want that.
Yeah.
I also loved it. I would come back for more, so you hooked me. And I love the way you're able to, to the extent that you are setting these scenes, you're doing a lot of work in just this first episode.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, especially since we don't know what's coming next, are you going to say more about Dahl's childhood? The part where you mentioned the death, the father, sibling, sister. Are we going to learn anything about his mother? And to what extent do you want to weave in a little bit more about his own childhood, just given that he's becomes this writer for children? I found myself wanting to know a little bit more about his childhood.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I'm curious how other people feel. I very much did not want to do a cradle to the grave biopic. I just felt like that would be the typical way of doing it. It can get boring. His childhood, I think, is important for how it impacts his future life, but I'm not sure his childhood is actually that interesting. So what I've done is I've saved it for a future episode, which might be too confusing, and maybe I'd be curious if you guys feel like you can't latch on to Dahl. That's my fear, that you can't latch on to him in the first episode because you don't know where he came from. I try to do away with it with
that
Dahl.
far to say that I couldn't latch on personally.
Okay.
Just wondering what else was out there.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to understand more motivation.
Yeah.
I think we hear that he's bored,
Yeah.
which is also very typical of a young man traveling, that sort of thing. But I think just to dig in a little more, it's like, does he have a sense of patriotism? Like, where does this drive come from, just beyond not wanting to be at home?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Right here, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. It was wildly entertaining, and
Oh, good.
but also as a big Roald Dahl fan, I was actually reading some of him like the other day, so I was super excited to come. I didn't really want to hear from your parents in the beginning. I didn't
Okay.
want it to be about you.
Uh-huh.
I thought it was an interesting question you had earlier about like, was Roald Dahl a worthy subject? And to me, the thing that would have been more compelling is, well, I do some work with children, and sometimes I talk to them about books they're reading, and they have adult things to say about Roald Dahl characters. And I thought that talking about how many books he's sold was insufficient to talk about the impact that he's had. And that's really the note. And then it was sort of like, the curiosity was like, I wonder if it would be more compelling with like actual kids' perspectives who are interacting with his books today. Because I just thought like, yeah, it's interesting the marmalade, it's interesting the numbers, but he is such a big character, and I think to really paint why he is a worthy subject is beyond that. And I kind of felt that we got into the plot too soon. Was just my thinking.
Interesting.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
It's so incongruous to me that this spy should have turned out to write James and the Giant Peach and Willy Wonka.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so, so two different places.
Right.
And I also am old enough to have read Kiss Kiss first
Yeah.
before those children's books. And it was very strange to me that he went on to be a children's book writer, because that's now how I first met him. And I'm also old enough to remember the Patricia Neal stuff later, because that was my sort of teenage years.
Yeah.
So there's whole pieces of it, But I
Yeah.
think the getting us into it by talking about the spies and James Bond and so, is really compelling, and it kind of draws a picture of him and how did that guy become that children's book author.
Yeah.
And I think
Good.
maybe you can make that connection a little stronger or something.
Okay.
But I'm hooked. I want to hear more.
Great.
I'm going to come right over here first.
Hello, this was so wonderful, so thank you. I guess I would say like a note on the notes. I think if you're gonna be part of the story, be part of the story. Like, introduce yourself as a character. Like, why are you there? Why are you involved? Why should I, as the listener in my subway ride to work who's listening to Spotify, care about you? And I care about you, I'm here, whatever. But like a random person listening to a podcast, like, why are you the podcaster interesting? Why are you centered in the story? Like, be a character if you're a character.
Well, what kind of stuff would you have wanted to hear?
Well, like, who are you? Like, introduce yourself. Like, have the listener, I think, like, get to know you. And if you're going to talk about, like, I'm from DC, this is my wife, like, okay, if I'm listening to a podcast, I don't know anything about you. So, like, introduce yourself to the podcast listener in a way that it's like, oh, you're like part of this story, and like, this is very cool. Like, you know so much about him. This is so interesting, and you're a character. And it would be cool if you were a character and you're like, I discovered Roald Dahl in this formative time of my life and studied him for years and years and years, and these are the things that I learned, and I changed my mind about certain things or whatever it is. But like, if you're a character, be a character, I guess, is
great.
what I would contribute. And then also in the intro, I think like if you're a character, be a character in the intro, and then also like maybe like bottom line up front of like he's so interesting and everyone has like all these thoughts about him. So I think that's what you're trying to say is like people think that they know these things about him, but actually he's so much cooler and more interesting and bizarre than anyone really knows. So maybe like just lead with that. Like he was a spy, he was this. But people are like, oh, I think he was this like hunchbacked weirdo that he wasn't. So maybe just like hit the, I'm sort of thinking about like myself in the subway. If I like have 5 minutes, whatever, that if I'm like, oh, I didn't know that Roald Dahl was this and this and this and this. Like I need to listen to episode 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever.
Great.
Anyway.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I just to that point also like I think you should get rid of all percentages because love the episode, but no one wants to hear numbers. But I think putting yourself in the story and also bringing your audience into the story by saying things like, how many of us did not imagine getting that golden ticket at some point when we bought a chocolate bar, right?
Yeah.
So bringing yourself into your really specific memories, like when did you first read or hear James and the Giant Peach? I still remember hearing it in 3rd grade when it was read out loud to the class, and put yourself literally in the Roald Dahl stories, perhaps as something to ground why you are doing this whole series. I think that would be really a much more powerful start because it will make it more personal for everyone who's listening. Overall, I loved it. I think the irregulars are fascinating. There's so much to say there. Obviously, you have to pick and choose what you say. There was only one thing that I didn't quite understand is that one thing is I do think you should say, you don't say why the father and sister, how they died.
Yeah.
I think I certainly was like, that's a pretty big statement to put just in there and not have anything else around it. You mentioned that some of what the irregulars were doing was to bring the U.S. into the war, but actually the U.S. was in the war. At least they had already declared as being in the war when this happened. So I felt there was a little disconnect there that maybe it was to get them to send more or send people or whatever it is, but they did, they're in the war in 41, so this happens in 42, I think. So I wasn't 100%, didn't quite get that. But anyway, overall, fabulous. Love the morally flexible line and various other comments.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I really liked it, and also had no idea actually about. I would have been one of the callers at the beginning who knew very little other than the books. My favorite thing, and I assume we'll get more of them. I didn't need more of it now. Is the resonances between plot lines in his books and how they come out of. They seem fantastical in the books, but of course they're not. On that note, like when you're talking about the famous characters at the beginning, not that I don't know Willy Wonka. Although I don't actually know the BFG, but it would have been nice to just have even just for only one of them, just like a brief, very brief, Willy Wonka, the guy who, such and such, owns the chocolate factory and is eccentric in this, and this way, just to kind of bring us back there a little bit more, even though we kind of all know it, just kind of remind us. On the note of what she was saying about putting yourself in, I agree, and it seems like the obvious resonance, and you do this. I mean, it's there. It just if you wanted to draw it out more, you could. Is the DC stuff, right? And maybe the slight contrast with you growing up in DC, kind of nose against the glass, whereas he, may have briefly had his nose against the glass, but pretty soon he's part of the show. Yeah. And then lastly, just a super small thing. When you say towards the end of the episode, because I'm listening to it and I'm going to listen to the future episodes, and it maybe best of all made me excited to keep listening because there's obviously a lot more. But when you said he could be prone to exaggeration, I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that's something you need to get into and we'll get into. But I had the brief of oh God, was everything Aaron just said exaggerated? And my guess is no, but you just want to make sure.
Totally. Yeah, great.
And then, did you, oh, you're good, okay. All right, and just, we can take 2 more just right here.
Oh, hi.
Hi, I loved it. What a ride. Great voice, very fun story. A couple of small notes, and I agree with a lot of the very smart commentary here. I thought there were a couple of instances where you didn't trust your material quite enough. Like the irregulars are great. I actually don't need the Vince Vaughn analogy. It kind of takes me out of it. Like I want to picture them as they are.
Great.
And there were a couple of moments like that where I was like in a cocktail party with all these people in tuxedos, and then you'd kind of interject and take me out of it a little bit. So I like the note of you being a character, but I think you want to be pretty careful about when you're offering that commentary and don't break up the spell that you're casting. And a couple of times, when he writes that letter to his mother, like you can really milk that. That's an amazing detail.
Yeah.
And then I don't think I need you to come in and say like, wow, that's so crazy. You know what I mean?
So wait,
stands on
milk
its
it
own.
how then if I'm not
Just
commenting?
you can make a meal out of it. You did, but I think you can build it up even more.
Build it more.
And then at the beginning, I think that you may have. I think you want to make the beginning before the spy stuff go more quickly. And I think that you can, as someone said, speak to his amazing literary exploits a little more efficiently. But I think it's more complicated. I think you played up the avuncular side too much. And there's a real darkness and an ugliness in his books. Like Charlie and Chocolate Factory, people have warm feelings for. He hated those kids. He killed all of them. All of them died ugly, brutal deaths, except for Charlie. And each one of his books, the witches, the twits, like there's real nastiness in there. And I think that that's part of his story, that's part of his character. And introducing that up top will introduce some ominous notes.
You don't think we'll feel like we don't want to go on the journey with this bastard?
I think he's such a big deal. He's such a famous writer. Everyone knows him, will want to know him. I don't worry about that, particularly because of the intrigue that you're able to provide. He's a spy, famous people's wives, all of that stuff. No, I don't think you need to worry about the story you've got. It's really strong.
Tease us in the beginning. We'll know that's not who he is.
Yeah.
But that's probably why he has that. I'm sorry. That's probably why people think of him in that spoon shape. I love the spoon shape. Is because he was so mean to right? Isn't that why we picture him?
Complicated guy, contained multitudes, but yeah.
I think the final connection for me is the connection between you and the famous Mr. Dahl. He needed to escape from his life on that farm in the rural sections, and he got sucked into the greatest escape ever. And in your situation, you're teaching people to creatively escape through their writing. So you are on a parallel course, I think, with him in that respect. So I agree with bringing more of yourself into it, and it's like Eric Weiss, Harry Houdini. Escape is what he needed to get out of his life. Connect yourself to him that way.
Great. That's helpful.
I loved it. Really enjoyed it. I loved the scenes. Like you said, I was completely swept away. Just one question is, how do you want us to receive the Roald Dahl character? Like, what do you want us to think of him?
I guess in the first episode, I want you to feel like he's, like I was saying, like someone who contains multitudes, like someone who can have all of these very sort of seemingly diametrically opposed values and personalities within his one giant body. My hope is that as the season progresses, because remember, there's 9 more of these episodes, you will really get a full picture of the man. But I guess for now, all I'm trying to do in the pilot is hook you, is make you interested in hearing more of his story.
I might interject
Yeah,
really fast.
please. Sure.
Hi.
Just like we're back in class.
I know, right? Narcissistically, of course, I'm going to talk about the lines that I read. I really like the catharsis of sort of like, it starts with a slight interjection of his own voice into these sort of military correspondences. And, that last one, especially, about the not being too sexed, is really, really fun. But I think that you might need a little bit of his personality sort of in the beginning, probably on page 11. just so that you get a little bit of foreshadowing, and then there's sort of the clamming up and then going, because it's such a good track. It's just you don't quite see it coming as it opens up. So that might provide
Who he
a little bit of
becomes.
the... Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, that's a good idea.
Awesome. Thank you so much. One more round of thanking Aaron tonight
Thank
for
you
coming
guys
out
so much.
here.
I really appreciate everybody coming. It's so great. Thank you.
Thanks again, and thank you everyone for coming. And if you could just leave the notebooks, we can collect them afterwards and appreciate the feedback.
Or, take it and email me if you didn't get
there you
to say
go.
your piece tonight.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.